better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you need a wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life.
Hello, Rob. So tell me what you want, what you really, really want.
Matt, I want to be a game master. I've thought about this a lot, and
Great
I
answer.
think that's what I want to do. I want to be a game master, and luckily for me and for us, I have right here a book entitled "So You Want to Be a Game Master." So I'm well equipped, I think, to achieve my goal here.
Yes, and this is everything you need to start your tabletop adventure for Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and other systems by a friend of the show, Justin Alexander. And
often known as the Alexandrian, from the long-running and beloved website. I know that this is a new concept for blog, for some of our younger listeners, but it used to be that you could just have a website that stood on its own, not attached to any sort of social media network or app. Anyway, so the Alexandrian.net is a great resource for all kinds of things. I've used it a bunch. And Justin Alexander, the author, runner of that website, has published this book, and we are going to review it.
Yeah. And I want to start with the big picture here. Is you're getting over a 500-page paperback book with all sorts of game master advice. And there's lots of stuff here, but the meat of the book, just so, like what everyone is aware of, I tried to, do my grad student best to distill down what's the thesis of this book. And the majority of the advice, which is very, very good, is how to structure play in the sort of medium term at your table for memorable and logical and really fun interactive play that favors player agency.
I think that's a very, very strong thesis. I'm going to save a lot of the big picture stuff for the end, but this is a very meaty book full of really good advice, and a lot of this was, I want to say, tested on the blog.
Workshopped.
Workshop. Thank you. You may find some repeats. That is not a criticism of this book. It's amazing for me to have it all in one place. So, just because you may find some things that have appeared on the Alexandrian before does not mean that this is not a iteration and improvement on that. So you could think of this as, the blog made manifest, but it really is kind of a cohesive driving toward allowing you to be a better game master. And what that means is it varies from person to person, and there's a lot of elements that go into being a game master. But what Justin Alexander is really, really good about: organization, structure, and making memorable and dynamic campaigns, encounters, situations, dungeons, and he gives you a lot of tools and a lot of advice for doing that.
Yeah.
And we're not going to be able to talk about everything that's in here. And in fact, I think Matt and I will probably return to this as a resource for future episodes, but we will try to go over most of what's in it so you know what you're getting.
So one incredible compliment that I want to give this book, and why I think recommend it to pretty much all of our readers, is I feel like a lot of game master advice, this podcast included, often falls into three things that are not totally useful all the time. First, a lot of game master advice is here's the one way to do it. And it's actually just a screed against a type of game mastering or system that person doesn't like. And this is not that. And thank God it's really good, right? There's a lot of liberties, this may work for you, this may not. This is why I approach it in this way. So this is not a one true way to game master book. So I love that.
The advice in this, to build on what Matt is saying, is that one of the extreme strengths and the awesome things about this book is that everything in this is actionable. It's specific. Like there's plenty of advice. And I will make no apologies for this, but Matt and I give a lot of high level advice because I think a lot of being a game master is kind of wishy-washy, but everything in here is very concrete. It's like, do this. Here's some suggestions. Here's some precise, specific steps to take for you to improve your game, to design an encounter, to design a adventure, a session, etc. You will find things that you can do. You will not read this book and then be like, how do I put this into practice in my life? It is very specific about here's how you can use these rules, ideas, scenarios, situations in your own games.
Point number 2 is that a lot of game master advice, again, especially our podcasts included, is a lot of what I would call like tips and tricks, like little ephemera around the edges of game mastering. And while there is that in the book, like, oh, here's a chapter on what if your party splits up, right? Or but if you go online or to advice podcasts like our own or YouTube channels, there's a lot of try this funny voice or this one little trick to improve things. That's all great, but it doesn't really get to the meat of what game mastering is. And the core of this book, while it does have good tips and tricks, is like the essential basics of planning and executing good adventures and sessions and campaigns. So there's less ephemera and more core gameplay loop stuff, which I love.
Exactly. And, it must be said that, Justin Alexander runs a specific type of game and he has a preference for certain RPGs, but this is intended to be a general book of advice. And I do think it works for that with some caveats that we'll talk about later, but it will be, I think, more useful for certain types of game masters than others. But I think it could be useful for every game master to be quite honest. Like there is a lot in here that is really, really useful, general advice, but that is actionable. That is something that you can specifically do and suggestions for how to do that.
That's an excellent point and segues to my third thing that this doesn't do, which is really, really great, which is it's not specific to any system, though it is oriented in general towards the most popular fantasy role-playing games. You'll find plenty of examples and things that work from everything from Shadowrun to Fate. But, if you're looking for Dungeon Master advice, the place you might, end up if you don't end up on podcasts and YouTube channels is like the chapter or book for the game master for whatever RPG. You flip to the chapter on running the game or the Dungeon Master's Guide, and you'll find in those chapters that it's often just a bunch of rules for adjudicating certain things within the system. And there may be a small section on running this type of campaign. But if you're like me, you always wish that section and advice was like 10 times longer and less about how to allocate magic items or distribute plot points or something like that related to the specific system. And this one, is not specific to any system. I think you can take useful advice from the core chapters of this book for any game.
Yeah, I have more to say, but I think we should jump into some of
let's get into specifics.
What's in here before I get distracted by that. So there are 5 parts to this book and a sort of, let's call it an appendix. And the parts are in order: dungeons, mysteries, raids and heists, urban adventures, and then into the wild. And the part titles tell you pretty much what to expect from each of those sections.
And so I love this, Rob. The book is organized logically in that each section builds on skills you might have learned in the previous section. But what you might pick up from those chapter or part titles is that you're basically learning how to game master through a broad and vague popular history of the development of tabletop role-playing games, starting in a dungeon, developing more complex mysteries, etc., etc. So it's kind of a nice treat. It's like, hey, you This is kind of how the game developed organically over the years in a very broad sense.
Yeah, and you could, and you might pick this up and skip to the section that you are most interested in if you are running a heist game or a hex crawl or something like that. But it actually is meant to be read linearly because, like Matt said, in each section there's, I guess, like sort of building blocks that Alexander uses later on to sort of build a toolbox for being a game master. And in that sense, it makes a lot of sense to start at the beginning and read through the whole thing, even if you aren't precisely running a game that has dungeons or uses dungeons. There's a lot of good stuff in each of these that is relevant and comes back for future chapters. I wish that this had been a little bit clearer, but ultimately I did read it linearly, so it doesn't matter. But this was honestly, I was really impressed with how he did this, and so there's a lot that you will learn from each individual section that sort of becomes this toolbox that at the end you can use to run any sort of game.
Let's get into specifics. I want to start with an example from the first chapter of something that I've read a bit about before, but having it cleaned up and laid out is really great, which is the small chapter on rulings and how to approach the general, how do you turn that conversation between you and a player, between players and players, that the basic gameplay loop of players stating what they want to do and you basically saying, yeah, you do that. Or you saying, I don't know when to call for checks and when to not.
Yeah, this is really good. This is I don't want to say basic, but it is
basic. It's basic.
But it's really well articulated. I really like his approach to rules and rulings, and I think that he lays it out in a terrifically simple and precise way. I think that it's got everything about, default to yes, but all of these things. This is core game master stuff, and it's really well written out here.
It's better than basically the when to roll a check section in any published role-playing game that I've seen. And for that reason alone, you should get this book. My favorite part of this section is really remembering that you have a bit of tabletop role-playing judo available to you at all times, which is, remember, if you're at a loss or you're not sure what to do, you can just say, whatever crazy thing that you wanted to do, you do that. Now, what do you want to do? Right? Let's deal with the consequences of that and really turn the creativity back on your players. And they're, almost always ready for that because this is what they want to do. So if they come up with something crazy, just say, quoting here, yes, that happens. Now, what do you want to do?
Exactly. We often get bogged down in this, and I think that, like Matt said, most GM advice sections do not address this anywhere near as clearly as it is addressed in this book.
And then also to put on your sticky note are the follow-up questions, quoting from the book. How are you doing that, and what are you trying to do? Most of the time, if you're not sure if you're defaulting to yes or saying yes, but or no, it's because you need to ask players these two questions. You need to clarify what they actually mean or what are they actually using to accomplish this.
Yes, exactly. Yes. The other thing that this book is so good about is there's tons of examples of everything, examples of play, examples of certain gameplay elements as Alexander talks about them. This is really, really it's just a book that's rich with what does this look like in practice, which I think is just a really, really, that is something that is missing from a lot of written campaign books, adventures, core rule books. Either the examples are limited or they're not very good or a combination of the two, but there's just a ton here to show you what this looks like in play.
Yeah. And speaking of that in play, the next session is on running dungeons, and it not only includes how to run dungeons, how to run rooms, how to key a map, how to put your information and organize it, how to make dungeons interesting, but it also includes like a little dungeon tracker worksheet for players when exploring dungeons, and an example dungeon which with explanations on how it was built and how you might run it.
Yeah, this is not the point of either this book or this review, but I liked this example dungeon, and I thought it was a really instructive one to read because Alexander talks about why and how it was built and like what the function of each room is and the enemies. It's a neat little volcanic tube situation full of mephits and other bad guys. This is a great like low level dungeon, and it's a very educational one to read about and read his process for.
There's also rules that people who are not familiar with older editions of D&D and D&D like games might have not encountered before, which is the dungeon turn. The author here, Justin Alexander, states like, you can read this and decide you don't want to use it, or just kind of use it in a vague sense for tracking what people are doing. But I found that really a nice way of framing how exploration of a dungeon or a dungeon-like structure should work. And, again, there used to be kind of these rules in D&D, but they've gone by the wayside. They're not a mechanical part of the game. And if you wish you had that, you just need to flip to this section of the book. And these rules would work great in Pathfinder 2e or Dungeons & Dragons 5e.
I shouldn't pull my punches, even though he's a friend of the show. I do not like the dungeon turn, but like Matt says, it's optional, and Alexander says so when he starts the section. And I'm being a hypocrite here because Pathfinder 2e includes something a little bit like this, but a lot simpler. So it's not a bad idea. I never liked the dungeon turn in the past, and I sort of don't like how it's been implemented. If it does help you, and this is where I was starting to understand that, not understand, but sort of running into a difference in both sort of like play style and strengths. But like Alexander is just much more organized than I am. And that's a me problem. And like, if this works for you and like, you're able to keep track of like, if having detailed notes and keeping track of this stuff is intuitive for you, then this is probably really useful. And in a sense, I kind of wish I were more organized, because then this offloads a bunch of like generalized stuff to just like a piece of paper or an initiative tracker. So if you are a structured and organized GM, or would like to be one, or like to be more of one, I gotta say this is a really, really good book for this. And we'll talk about more of that later, but it's given me tons of ideas for how to better organize my notes and how to better run my sessions and my campaigns. And this is something that I will probably not use, but it's a great example of something that's very like high level organization and very smart if you can implement it correctly.
3 other things I wanted to highlight really quickly from this dungeon chapter before we move on, which is Alexander goes through his own process for creating dungeon maps, says, this works for me, kind of this vague mapping to more detailed mapping, how to key encounters, how to make rooms interesting. Something I really liked is the 3x3 rule, where
can we pause on this, because
let's pause on the 3x3 rule.
I really want to gush about this, because this is brilliant, and I'm borrowing it immediately to help with my descriptions. So correctly, he points out that like you don't want to get too bogged down in room descriptions, but like as we all know, and everyone who's run a dungeon, there's lots of descriptions of moisture dripping down stone walls,
etc.
Yeah, you see an empty room and there are 5 bars over so he's got these rules of thumb, which is 3 basic ideas, 3 of 5. Think about your 5 senses, include 3 of them in your description. He also, and this is so rad, he talks about some sort of advanced senses like balance, which is your vestibular sense, movement, temperature, pain, and like super sensory, ultra human, like what you might see through like magic or fancy equipment or something. So that's the first one. There's 2 cool details, and then 3x3. And this is the really good one. Each featured room should have 3 elements from, sort of this list. It's not just a bookshelf. It's a tall bookshelf in the corner. It's shelves crammed with scrolls and books. This is, I would just write out the bullets. I'm going to write out the bullets of this section of advice, and just when I am designing a room, follow it. And this is, you don't have to be bound by these, but I think this is a great checklist for, I've got a dungeon room. What do I need to think about to give it just a little bit of character? This is one of my favorite parts of the whole book. And he references it again because it doesn't just apply to dungeon rooms. You use the same sort of descriptive menu, I guess, when talking about all kinds of things. So this is one of my favorite examples of, distilling a lot of the sort of wishy-washy details of game design and game mastering into a specific checklist that is actionable. And for me, I'm good at some things when it comes to game mastering, but I actually kind of struggle with descriptions unless I've thought about it a lot ahead of time. So this for me was a really, really useful section.
And I know this works because I know the least interesting scenes or rooms in any type of game are the ones that have just one thing, right? And when you give players this multiple descriptions, multiple senses, multiple features in rooms that vary of type, then they come into their own as explorers, adventurers, investigators, depending on what kind of game you're running. It's really great. There's also, I think, a great explanation in this dungeon chapter of why you would use random encounter tables and actually how to make them work, right? That when you roll up, a D4 blink dogs, that doesn't tell you anything. That's a prompt for you. And then really great advice for how to make that interesting. But my absolute favorite thing in this first very meaty chapter, which starts with basic dungeons, how to make them interesting, how to make them dynamic and living so that players can visit them again and again, is basically how to map out a dungeon in simple chunks, right? A 5x5 dungeon, and then how to expand that into an even bigger dungeon, right? Or reduce it into a smaller dungeon, right? This is a basic template for planning any dungeon type adventure. Again, dungeon being, it could be warehouse, extra dimensional realm, caves in hell, anything, right? Anything that is locations.
Yeah, this is a really great section. And each of the 5 parts ends with literally a section called homework, which is actually very helpful. And if you are starting out, or even if you were sort of a middling experience GM, it's actually great to go through these because you will learn as you go. And I really appreciate this as a player, as somebody who has often tried to teach these things and all kinds of things. I learn by doing. I think this is a very, very smart approach to teaching how to be a game master. And if you are getting started or if you're trying to up your game, you could do worse than following the advice, which in this case is, here's how to build a 5x5 dungeon. Here's how to transition that into, a full campaign or a mega dungeon or a part of a larger adventure. And yeah, it's great.
Excellent advice on then, we could spend I think a whole episode on Xandering dungeons. Or on how to expand or collapse this 5+5 dungeon idea. But in interest of time and giving you a full review of what else is in the book, the next chapter is on mystery. Dungeons being this is our shorthand for players going and exploring or clearing a place, which is useful in basically every type of role-playing game. Mysteries are shorthand for a type of session or part of a session where players investigate and build data, items, or facts as they go from place to place that can be connected by clues or leads, right? Things that take them somewhere or to someone else.
Yeah, and this is this is very generally Call of Cthulhu, Blades in the Dark, any sort of mystery investigation game. And once again, Alexander has sort of structured this in a way that I find really, really helpful. he talks about the elements of scenes and the aspects of the mystery. And there's a lot of this, which is really smart in thinking about how to design the mystery itself.
Right. Just like we learn how to do rulings in the dungeon, this book decides to teach how to cut, as in how to start a scene and how to end a scene with the mystery section, which, starts with what do the players want to do or what do they want to find out, and then figure out where the action should begin there. And of course, the answer depends completely on the context of your adventure, your players, and what you've prepped. But how to do that so that mysteries don't become, well, then you walk down a road or you wander through a building. You cut to where the next meaningful action, choice, and dialogue will be.
And I really like, some of this is intuitive, but I really like it being written out. One of the things that Alexander talks about is that each scene has is connected to the other by intention, right? Like what are the players intending or trying to do? And that creates a vector, right? Which helps you figure out what the next thing is. And especially I like, he talks about each scene has an agenda. And this is really smart. I think that if you are designing a mystery game or you're writing out a mystery that takes place where the core element is scenes, for example, like you might, for any investigative game, writing out the agenda for that scene. What is this supposed to accomplish is just it can be just like a sentence or even a phrase. But this is such a great way to keep yourself organized and also help, make sure that your players are staying on task. I think this is a, really smart way, simple way to organize and structure your adventure.
And this may seem, if you're not reading the book along with this podcast episode, slightly complicated, where we're talking about scenes that are connected by intention and driven by agenda. And you're like, what does this mean? Well, if you think about it, and the way the book explains it is, it's very, in a sense, not that different than a little fancy dungeon that you've made, except walking down corridors is connected by player intention. And the corridors that open up are determined by the clues and information available to the players, right? And that scenes, instead of being like getting a green slime off your arm or fighting 1d4 goblins, are what are the stakes here? What can the players find out? What are they trying to accomplish? And, will they find that out, or will they fail, or will something else happen? Right. And so when you lay it out like that, and if you want to, hey, I'd like to prep an interesting mystery or investigation, I don't know how to do this. This system gives you a formalized way of doing that won't end up with players meandering all over the place.
Right. And like Matt said, it may not make a lot of sense if you're not reading along with us. There's a bunch of, Alexander uses a lot of terminology or comes with a lot of ideas for describing elements of a scene, things like cuts and bangs and transitions and all that. And, these make sense when you read it, but we're, I don't want to get bogged down in that. But once again, there's great lists of things to include in your scene, check boxes or checklists that you want to go over to make sure that it's fully fleshed out. What are the leads? What are the clues? Who are the characters? What are the features for this particular scene? All these things you can just, this is one of the great things about this book is it gives you essentially a checklist for any type of session that you can sort of go over and be like, have I hit all of these that I need to or that I want to? And is my scene, is my adventure ready to run?
Yeah. And of course, there's lots of great specific advice, some of which we've talked about on the show before, like the 3 clue rule. But beyond that, there's like a lot of great advice for how do I come up with clues. You could work from the conclusion of your investigation, or you could work from the skill list that's available to your players.
I loved this. This was such I underlined this. This is such a good idea. Yeah, if you run any sort of investigative game, this book is worth the price just for that. But like, there's so many good examples and ideas for coming up with clues. And again, you always need more clues than you think. So this is a really useful resource to have. there's a bunch of really good advice in here from just, mysteries in general. One of my favorite things, and I've read this quote before, but I hadn't thought about it in the context of a TTRPG, but Raymond Chandler wrote one time, when you're stuck, like, both in a story or whatever, is that have a guy with a gun walk through the door. And this is, like, by the way, this is a great piece of advice for any RPG. If your players are just absolutely floundering, you can get things moving by just having something shake it up like that.
I had to do this in one of my Star Trek adventures, except it was 3 Chimeran mercenaries with disruptor rifles. Just like, you're getting too close. And of course it was this is a thing that happens in investigations that is very much detailed in this chapter. Sometimes players have the answer, but they've somehow convinced themselves they need to do more. And so that's when you're like, okay, well, maybe I should, because of the timing of our session, have someone decide you're getting too close to the answers, which they had the correct answer. And of course that was the perfect push to get them to say, okay, yes, let's go confront the murderer.
So the corollary to the 5-room dungeon at the end of the mystery section is the node-based adventure. And Matt and I have talked about this before because we really like it. I really like node-based adventuring, and this is another great section that outlines how to design and build nodes and create an adventure that runs this way, and there are instructions for making your own. It's just like a terrifically useful, valuable resource.
Because I've had nothing but praise for this book so far, if I had one critique, is I loved how in practice the dungeon section was, where we had an example dungeon from conception to mapping it out to how to run it. Sadly, I think, this book is 540 pages. There's probably just not room. I would have loved a chapter or an example fully fleshed out for each of these other chapters. Sadly, there's only room for the dungeon, but there's not one for the mystery.
There are rougher examples.
Oh yeah, there's still examples.
But no, but you're correct though. The one that receives the most love and the most detail is the dungeon. And yeah, it's already a long enough book, but it would have been nice to have a matching one for each of these other types of adventures.
There's more we could talk about on how to make your investigations and mysteries proactive, and how to make them non-linear, and how to make them really, really large instead of like a short thing. It's all great advice, but I think we should move on, unless we have any other points about mysteries, to the next part, which is raids and heists.
Raids and heists.
It's similar to a mystery in that players are trying to find or get something or accomplish something. It's similar to a dungeon in that there's a location, but it's different than both in that players want to accomplish an objective that takes place in a location, right? You can think of a Shadowrun session being a raid, or any of the mini heists we've talked about on this show before, being a heist. The players have to go get something, a person, a place, a thing, an idea, a target, and they come up with a plan to accomplish that target. And how do you prepare for that and run that as a game master?
Yeah, this was interesting. I had never, not that I'd never heard of a raid, but I'd never distinguished it like this, because the general structure that Alexander describes the raid is you scope out a place and you make a plan and then you execute, which is generally how I run heists, but it's not exactly the same. And I kind of like this distinction. And I also really liked this section just for me personally, because I love to give my players a compound or a warehouse or a castle and be like, have fun, figure out how you're going to go inside. And unfortunately, my players struggle with that. I have to stop doing it because every time I think I've given them something cool, they get like just overwhelmed by choice. But there's a lot of great advice in here for how to encourage your players to approach it, how to guide them towards success, and how to run this part of either a raid or a heist, which is really, really smart.
if chapter 1 was based off of the original iterations of Dungeons and Dragons and chapter 2 was based off of Call of Cthulhu, Raids and Heists are based off of some newer games, Blades in the Dark and Night's Black Agents. And I think what distinguishes the raid or the heist from the dungeon crawl, at least according to Alexander, and I agree, two things that players have a plethora of information, and that information gathering is part of the game that you're playing, that there's a timing element involved to some degree.
Yes. This is time bound in a way that, well, it's necessarily time bound, like a dungeon might be or a mystery might be, but I think a raid or a heist, and this is correct, has to be. There is a time element that is important, and he's got a section on raid turn, like a dungeon turn, and in this case, I like it, and there's a lot of good advice here, and I especially liked...
I think a lot of Shadowrun could use a raid turn.
I was specifically thinking about...
There's nothing in between, and 3-second combat ticks.
Yes. Like Blades in the Dark makes this easy for you. It doesn't have raid turns, but it has a lot of mechanics in place that I don't think that you necessarily need them. But I think that if you are running in a system that does not have something like this, Shadowrun definitely comes to mind. Something like a raid turn is really helpful. I really, really liked this breakdown for enemy squads, enemy groups called
Alert, aware
procedure.
The AAA. Yes. This is good.
And again, lots of like great mnemonics, lots of great like, 3s and 5s. And this one's, for me, again, running these games is so great. Your groups are either active, alert, or aware, and these are just sort of like, these are like the stars in GTA, right? Like how
literally put some stars on a little sheet you can
exactly.
photocopy.
Write a little star next to this squad has 2 stars. They're aware that somebody's in the building, but they don't know where. This squad has 3. They have seen the crew and they are moving. This is again one of those examples of, again, I'm not that organized. I would love to be more organized, and I'm like, I should start doing this because this is a simple, smart, actionable way to keep yourself, keep your various groups, keep it in your mind, like where they are and like how they're likely to interact with or act as the raid turn progresses. This is really smart stuff.
Yeah. This is also the section where we see some great advice on some of the nuances of mechanics in role-playing games that might not come up in an investigation or a dungeon crawl. Like, hey, how often do I make that rogue who's sneaking through the compound make a stealth check? If the answer is every time they move, they're going to have a bad time by the laws of probability. How do I make this interesting without just making them roll checks until they eventually fail and alert everyone? Introducing, again, some great advice gleaned from other games around a point of uncertainty, right? Where you can have them roll a check and we introduce new things, and do they want to change their approach or kind of let their original activity that they're doing kind of, if you want to formalize it, on the raid turn ride.
Yeah. Like we mentioned, each section builds on the previous one and introduces some sort of general advice. And there's a lot of great general advice in this one about skill checks, about role playing, about running the game, about how to adjudicate things that are likely to come up in a heist, but are relevant to any campaign, any adventure. And like I keep saying, it's extremely actionable. There's just randomly like a little piece of advice on how to generate random floor plans with a D4, which is
so fun,
which is neat. I'm not sure I would use it, but I also wouldn't not use it. It's kind of it's just like a really like, here's how to roll, and if you need a floor plan in a pinch or like ahead of a session, it's cool stuff.
There's also great advice on using the kind of failing forward mechanics that are present in lots of role-playing games, and how they're especially important in this type of gameplay, and how what does a failure mean, where we can keep this going, and what are some examples of how to, what are you trying to accomplish? You're trying to open the door, but like, what's the threat here? Is it that you'll be discovered, that your tools will break, that you'll need to pay for another hacking app on your data jack. What's the cost that we could have you pay on a failure where we keep things going? So I absolutely love the very specific advice. I again, the raid turn is something like a dungeon turn. It's something where you could absolutely formally use, or it's something where like, I'm going to use this as a general guide for keeping track of, okay, the people in the biotech lab, the guards, the mercenary, the bounty hunter, all the people that are present in this location. I'm just going to, use part of this to keep track of what's going on as my players conduct this heist.
Yeah. It's very excellent advice. And there's a great section. There's another, again, section on designing and building a heist, which, if nothing else, serves as a really great checklist for here's some things that you should think about when you are designing your adventure. Just things to go through, elements of each room, each location, each enemy group that you want to consider. And for that, it's just like, incredibly useful.
I also want to point out that like any good role-playing book, all of the things that you would want photocopies of, like the running dungeons or the hex scroll sheet, are available online for free. So that's also amazing. And if we don't have any other points on raids and heists, there's some great examples on how to do flashbacks. We should talk about Urban Adventures, Part 4.
This is not about a specific type of adventure. It is about designing a city for an adventure to take place in, which I like. And it's, I'm a big fan of urban adventures, and so I think this is a great next step. And there's a lot of good stuff in here.
Yeah, just like, describing a room, describing districts or parts of a city, or these are applicable to really anything. A planet, a starship, that's like a generation ship. You have like districts that have landmarks, and these are things that give that the players notice when they go in there. And then what are like the general things that are available in this district? Where are the adventure sites? And one useful way that I really like from this chapter of how to organize this is in like layers of information, right? Rob, maybe it's because we were talking about reviewing like various Warhammer 40K role-playing games, but they always have multiple maps of the galaxy, but one map just shows where orcs live, and another map shows where like space marines have their like giant floating space bases. You should do that for your city, right? Have layers of, this is where vampires are. These are the layer of magic item shops. And of course, a lot of great mapping software makes this available now, or you can just do it in your key. But sometimes there'll be a thing that players find out about that introduces a whole new layer of information about a city maybe they've been in for a while.
Yeah, this is great advice. It's, like Matt said, you can do it in mapping software. Any image, like anything like Photoshop or GIMP has layers which you could do this with. It's a really smart idea, especially if you want to get really detailed with your city without overwhelming yourself or your players. There's also one really specific piece of advice that I love, which is he describes how to do a adventure at the gate scenario, which is something that we commonly do, but I love the advice for this, which is your adventurers arrive at the gate, and here are the things that they see: the countryside, the city, a short encounter, and then like, what they see when they step through the gate. And this could also be, you arrive by boat or by airship, or you step through a portal. But all of this, I think, is just like a great way to think about, if your players are arriving at a place for the first time, here's a quick checklist of things to have them experience so that they get a sense for the city. I really like this part.
Right. And by organizing this city, which you might have on a poster map or on your iPad or something like that, a picture of in districts, and giving those districts landmarks and themes, right? You can create meaningful player choices where, okay, we're going to the combat arena in the Dwarven district. No, we're going to the one in the Elven district, right? And then you can structure what happens next based on those choices that the player makes.
There's also great advice, and I often overlook this, or I don't formalize it, but there's great advice for scenic encounters and background information, for giving flavor to the city. I was thinking about this because one thing that Invisible Sun does really well is it has a bunch of, there's a very, very detailed gazetteer for the city where the players spend most of their time. And there's a lot of encounters that are just, here's something neat or weird about Saturnine, right? And not every game does a great job of that. Not every campaign book does. And I think it's important and it's easy to overlook. And there's some great advice for building those in here.
There's also great generalized rules, taken from McGay and D. Vincent Baker's role-playing games and from Blades in the Dark on progress clocks as a way to have really good downtime rules for a campaign. And obviously this works best in a city or a place with some sort of other intelligent creatures around, but it could be used for any campaign. And there's rules for your players. Okay, here's what I want to accomplish, right? And here's how you can help them accomplish that. Here's what factions are trying to accomplish. And here's how you can track that. So if you want a living city and players doing fun downtime things, here's some really great generic rules for that.
Yeah, I really like this. It draws heavily from Blades in the Dark, and this is one of the things that I love about Blades in the Dark, especially their rules for how factions interact with each other and how they might grow or shrink or change based on player actions, or sort of like the development of certain events. This is one of those things that creates a living game world, which I am always excited about and trying to do, that is not always easy to accomplish in traditional campaigns. But I love these rules, and I love the structure around, here's how these clocks and this downtime and these various elements might contribute to the city changing, the factions jostling for power. This is really great advice for building a city that changes as the players experience it and as they act within it.
And to top it all off, in the city section, there's a close to 10-page guide for running social events and like how to prep, how to make them interesting, and how to, be ready for players, mingling at a party, right? I think we've all included some kind of social event in our role-playing game, and I've never had a really good way to formalize what I should prep. And I often stumble at what I have. I don't have enough of this. I have too much of that, and no one ever interacts with it. I think this is a great guide for setting up a social event.
Our adventure Dice Hard begins with a social event, and I wish that we'd had this guide when we wrote it. That I like a lot about that, but I'm like, oh man, we really should have included some more things.
Right, we should have had 5 events and not 3, and 10 characters and not 5, and
a bit more
example topics of conversation. Yeah,
rumors. We should have included a name list in case the players wanted to talk to somebody who's not on the that. This is, again, it's really just like, it's not basic advice, but it's also not like groundbreaking, but it's just like a great structure and checklist for, here's what you need to make sure your social encounter goes off smoothly, everything that you might want to consider so that your players don't run into, you don't have to scramble to come up with something as your players work through it.
The final chapter, part 5, Into the Wild, covers what I guess we would call hex crawls and point crawls. So this is exploration, whether it's, mapping a sector of space, hopping from planet to planet, or, exploring the next mountain over in a wilderness or exploration campaign. So what do we want to say about this set? And this is kind of, we're back to a way to very formally structure what's going on.
Yeah, this is mostly just for me, but of the sections, this is the one that I'm least interested in, and the one that I'm probably less likely to use. There's a lot of rules for travel, a lot of rules for setting watches, a lot of rules for exploration that I I never liked them very much in traditional D&D campaigns, and I can't see myself deliberately including them. I'm glad that they're here.
The flip side is a lot of these rules are like no longer in the DMG.
That's
so
true,
if you're like,
actually, yeah.
hey, what is our players want to explore 50 miles to the west? They're heading to the volcano Mount Doom. How fast do they go? There's not those rules anymore. This has those rules.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Just because I've read them a dozen times doesn't mean that they are not relevant. And you're right that those aren't really in. I mean, I'm sure they're somewhere in the GM's guide, but they're not.
I don't think pace rules are in there anymore. But we have things like pace rules, and the reason we have them is we're like, okay, well, players want to go to a place that is through unexplored area. How do I make that happen? How do I make it interesting, right? And there are two options given to you. Mapping with hexes, or they can really be anything, or mapping with interesting points and routes between them.
Yeah, and Alexander makes the point, like, don't. Sometimes travel can just be you get there, right? Is the route meaningful? And this is something that he makes a lot of. He makes a good point of, which is if there's nothing interesting along the road, if there's no meaningful encounters or role play to happen, then you don't need to map out and play out the route. If they are just taking the road from one civilized city to the next, and there's unlikely to be anything of interest, and you could just say, they get there. Should we skip this is an important question to ask when it comes to travel. And as much as I love the Lord of the Rings and all Lord of the Rings related media, I think that one of the problems is that much of the books are J.R.R. Tolkien lovingly describing the English countryside through which he liked to take walks, and many subsequent fantasy and fiction writers have then come to believe that what happens on walks through idyllic countryside is important to the narrative, and it is not. So it's important to bear in mind.
Well, whether you want to do a crazy, dangerous, and weird Fallout hex crawl or a cozy English countryside hex crawl, if you're like, how do I get started on creating a hex crawl? Yeah, I don't think I've read a better, 30 pages on, okay, that's why hexes are this big. Oh, this is how I fill out hexes. This is how I make the map. Here's how you can get ideas. Okay, yeah, this is a lot of work up front. How do you tackle that? How do you run it? How do you adjudicate what players are wanting to do? This is great. I love this advice. It is very specific to saying, hey, I want to do a wilderness style adventure. But if that's what you want to do, this is a great chapter. And that's the meat of the book.
Yeah, I also, it's not my first encounter with this, but I liked the way that he describes a point crawl, which is a bit like a hex crawl, but instead of going hex by hex, you are traveling from meaningful location to meaningful location. And I like how this is structured. And this resembles more how I tend to run my homebrew when I do something like this. And this is, I think, starting with hex crawls and then doing point crawls really like gives everybody the full gamut of how you might run a wilderness adventure and lets you make your decisions based on that. It's really great advice.
I love the point crawl method, and it makes me want to go back and redo my Kingmaker campaign as a point crawl because it's much less work. And you understand the benefits of both, right? And the downsides of both, I think, reading this chapter. And we're to the end of the meat of the book, but there's still 100 pages left in So You Want to Be a Game Master. And this is a section that is extra credits. And I think it's best summarized as the greatest hits refined of the Alexandrian's Game Master advice from his blog. Are there any that we want to talk about that are really, really good?
This is all good. And in a sense, I honestly think that this is some of the best advice in the book, but it falls outside of the structure that I think that Alexander was trying to adhere to. So it comes at the end. Some things I particularly like are there's a section on quick world building and a player packet that I really like. that's just a quick list of like what you want to give to your players and not overwhelm them. Maybe my favorite part of this section is the universal NPC role-playing template. And
yeah.
Like the 3x5 or sorry, the 3x3 rule, this is not like groundbreaking information, but it's just like, it's a brilliant, perfect list of like, you could write this on a note card, but like, here's everything that you need for an NPC so that you can run them appropriately. And there's options for sort of like a generic one and ones for a little bit more detailed NPC, and then similar rules for villains. This is something that I was like, oh, I'm going to write this down. I'm going to revisit my NPCs with this in mind, because just having this written out and available so that I can reference it would save me a ton of effort. And it's something I should have been doing from the beginning.
Two pieces of advice that are really amazing in this section are that have worked with my games and make a ton of sense, which is, one, throw out a ton of NPCs at the players and keep the ones that stick, either because you're into role playing them or the players find them interesting. And next, connect those NPCs to strong contradictory opinions about each other, about the world, about the things that are going on in your campaign, right? That's how you make them interesting. You give your NPCs something to say about what's going on or other people so that players can bounce off of them.
Yeah, and if you follow this advice, you and your players do something like latch on to a throwaway NPC that you did not expect them to do, which happens all the time, then you have like something to work with, right? You have, you maybe have just like a few bullet points, but that's still more than just like a name. You don't end up with a Jarnathan situation. And that's, it's great advice.
There's examples on how to learn a new RPG, on how to run an open table, something that we got a question about not too long ago, and how to hook players into interesting scenarios. Really, this is some of my favorite short sections. I would say if you're an experienced GM, this is what I read when I only had like 5 minutes to pick up the book, and the other sections much longer. But they're like, fun little short stories at the epilogue of your novel, and they're all really, really great advice.
Yeah, there's some really like specific stuff in this, which is great. How to successfully split your party, how to run an open table, how to find players. Again, nothing groundbreaking, but like it really like covers a lot of the extra stuff, and again in concrete and actionable ways.
Yeah. Okay. I think, are we to final thoughts?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to start with, okay, again, it's, I said it before, but it's, since it was my thesis, I'm going to put it in my conclusion as well. Like, again, the tips and tricks, the final section of this book is absolutely amazing and perfect. But why I think this is a really good book is that the meat of the book has something else, whereas all other Game Master advice books I've gotten have been mostly tips and tricks. This has tried to teach you some clear procedures on how to do all the amazing things that you've seen other game masters do.
I couldn't agree more. And we spent the last hour gushing about all the good things in here. So I am going to level some criticisms.
Yeah, let's get some critiques.
I think Matt is probably going to disagree with me on some of these, and I welcome it. But as I was reading it, like three primary things sort of like occurred to me. And the first is, and this is not really a criticism, but this is a book that centers, for good reason, Dungeons and Dragons D20 style role playing. It is sort of like the bulk of the examples and sort of like the core thing that Alexander returns to. Now, Matt made the good point that Alexander is writing for an audience that includes, the most popular role playing game in the world. So most people who want to be a game master are going to want to know how to run D&D. My criticism there is that I think you sort of, I don't know, you want to write for the world that you wish that was. And I if it were me, I would have loved that if it had not started with a dungeon and centered that, most heavily. That's, again, as far as critiques go, it's a mild one. I obviously still got a lot out of this book, but it was for me a mild disappointment. The second thing that I kind of want to say is that I guess to me, again, this is not what I expected, to be honest. And it isn't if you had sat me down and said, Rob, you need to write how to become a game master, this is not the book I would have written. And because to me, this is a book about how to write and design and run a campaign, which to me is actually maybe like third or fourth on the list of things that you need to know to be a game master. What I want to say about that, though, is that, like I said earlier, what this is making me realize is that, like, my approach and the approach of many people to the act of game mastering and the act of running a game hinges on different things. And so while I'm looking for a different set of tools when it comes to being a game master, this may be more useful to somebody else, especially somebody who is trying to be more organized or structured or needs more help with those elements of the game. So I guess, like, to me, this reads a little bit more like, so you want to be a game designer, so you want to be a homebrew game designer rather than how you want to be a game master, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. I would say the majority of the book, right, is about how to organize and essentially prep your games, and that the advice on actual face time with your players is less. I think the theory and thesis behind, if you do a good job of prepping and you follow the really great advice for the kind of FaceTime interactions, you will have a fun game that empowers your players to be creative and come up together with an exciting experience. But yeah, no, I think that is a good criticism, is that the majority of this book is about prepping well, prepping smartly, prepping in a way that is logical and organized and empowers your players when they interact with what you've come up with.
Yeah, and at the end, rather than a critique so much, it makes me realize it's just a different approach. And I think this is a really valuable one. And so, when I was reading it, I was frustrated and I had written down a bunch of objections, but when I got to the end, I kind of realized what Alexander was going for, and it's less of he did something wrong or even something that I don't like, and it's just like not how I would have approached it. If I were going to tutor somebody on being a game master, I wouldn't, we would not discuss dungeons at any point. Like it wouldn't even be a part of the conversation until they were running their own game. But this starts with it. But like, I'm realizing that that's actually like a pretty smart approach. And this may be a really good way to teach any sort of game. And it does make sense, as much as I might wish to pretend that it's not the case, to start with running a dungeon and dungeon design. But I did want to kind of like be clear about like, that's what this book is about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a fair critique, because, but also, the flip side of that is, again, most of the game master advice I have encountered is about the sort of face-to-face experience where we're sitting around the table. How do I act? How do I behave? How do I talk and game with my players? And this is more heavily focused on the prep to empower beforehand. Which means, Rob, you'll still have to write your book of sitting behind the table, behind the screen with Rob.
Tales are behind the screen. So I said three things, but I've already forgotten what the third one was. So these, I wanted to, to make sure that I did voice those, but like, to be clear, at the end, I was energized and excited by this book. It's full of things that I'm going to put into practice in my game. I think that depending on who you are, this might be the perfect book if you're just starting out. I think that that's a toss-up. I do think that if you are anywhere from like a beginner to an advanced GM, this is going to have something, possibly many things that you can make use of. And it's definitely worth checking out.
It gets my personal seal of approval for like two reasons. One, it was like reading through it as someone who has game mastered for a while. Like there are a lot of things that I'm like, yeah, maybe I was doing something wrong here. This does seem like a good idea. Or other things are like, oh yeah, that helps me understand why some things I've done have been successful and why other things have not. And then I have also already used it as kind of a reference when I've like, okay, my players are doing something that is similar enough to a raid or heist next time. I'm going to flip to that chapter. My players are arriving at a new city. I'm going to flip through the urban section as I'm prepping this city and see if I'm missing anything or see if this can help me organize my thoughts or spark some creativity. So it's been of use to me in two ways. So bing, seal of approval.
Yeah, same. There's a campaign I've been noodling on, which this just sort of like kicked into high gear because it helped sort of clarify some of the first steps that I need to take to sort of like get that off the ground. And that is one of the things that's incredibly useful about this book is like, no matter what session you're trying to run, encounter, dungeon, adventure, campaign, it's outlined and there's a list of steps and approaches, which really, when you're starting from scratch or stuck, like this is just incredibly useful for just like helping you, pointing you in the right direction and helping you structure your game. It's so good. He's got just like a brilliant mind, Matt. Like it's just like, he's rotating the cubes so well. It's
so
just,
many cubes. Yeah. There are cubes and dodecahedrons and octahedrons throughout the
There's
art
a bunch of like
book.
shapes on the cover.
So
yeah,
he is not rotating cubes. He's rotating mini polyhedrons.
That's right.
He's moved beyond cubes. Yeah. So I would just say, yeah, if you want to up your Dungeon Master game, especially prep wise, this is, I think, your best purchase. I think in like real world news, I think the first printing has already sold out, but another printing is on the way. So we're not the only ones who like this.
Him tweet like yesterday that there's a second printing. So keep your eyes peeled. But yeah, the first one sold out already.
So yeah, so you want to be a game master, this has been, I've read through many role-playing advice books so far. This has been my favorite of them. We should talk about some of those other books eventually on this show. We should mention that we were sent advanced copies of this for free by the author for review. But of course, that definitely did not bias our reviews in any way. But thank you for sending us these, Justin.
Yes, thank you. And like Matt has said, like a lot of the other game master advice books have the same type of advice and things in common. Again, much like what you're hearing on this podcast. And if nothing else, So You Want to Be a Game Master is distinct in a lot of very like measurable ways from all of those books. It is extremely focused on here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to work on. Here's some steps to take to get your prep going and get moving. And that makes it stand out regardless of whether or not that's what you need or what you are looking for in this type of book. That makes it a really like standout addition to the genre.
Yeah, and if you've been a person who has read the Alexandrian blog for a long time and you're like, well, I've got the best, I think the way that this is organized makes it, if you are a fan of any of those, there's more here for you, just because I know there was more here for me, because I've read, I think, every post on this blog about game mastering advice, but having it organized, having the homework, having the examples for the different structures of play sessions, it's just really incredible. It's really useful.
Yeah. So yeah, that's So You Want to Be a Game Master. It comes very much with the Dungeon Master of None seal of approval. There's a lot in here, and we'll be referencing it and talking about it more, because each section has a bunch of like cool stuff, and I kind of want to dig deeper on that at some point. So stay tuned for more about this, but I hope this was useful. Let us know if you have picked this up or you want to pick it up, and if you have some thoughts of your own.
Yeah, send us an email at dmofnone@gmail.com, or you can add us on Twitter at dmofnone with your impression of this book or your suggestion for other books of Dungeon Master, Game Master advice.
Yeah. Check us out on our Patreon or the Discord. And thanks for listening. Whatever you do, keep rolling them dice.